I'm going to show you 5 steps to get started making Game Boy games. I'll even show you the absolute fastest way to make one of your own. And if you wait to the end, I'll give you a bonus step. The first step is to pick tools and set them up. There are 3 paths you can take: Assembly, C, and GB Studio. Assembly is for anyone who wants to squeeze every bit of performance out of the Game Boy, or who just wants an excuse to learn assembly programming. C is for anyone who cares about performance and freedom, but doesn't want to spend an hour writing an if statement. And GB Studio is for anyone who wants to jump right into making their game without having to learn a bunch of technical details right off the bat. They're all great options, and they each have their pros and cons. Assembly is the classic choice. It gives you the most direct control over the Game Boy's hardware. And like I said, it's the choice that will let you squeeze the most performance out of the Game Boy. It can also be a fun challenge if you've never done any assembly programming before. The downsides are that assembly tends to be a less productive language than higher level options. It generally takes more effort to write something with assembly compared to doing the same thing even in C. It's also really easy to get lost in the details when writing assembly. It's always surprising to me how much thought I end up putting into writing what's essentially a simple if statement. I'm not an expert or even an experienced assembly programmer though, so take that for what you want. Another downside of assembly is that it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. Maybe you'll lose track of what you're using the different registers for, and you have to go back and rewrite a bunch of code. Or maybe you were too focused on solving a problem that you didn't notice that you wrote an absolute maze of unreadable code, and now you're left scratching your head trying to refactor it. If you're not careful, you can get yourself into trouble. But if it's something that's interesting to you, don't let that scare you off. It can definitely be a lot of fun. There's a bunch of resources on gbdev.io to help you out, and I'll link to my Game Boy assembly crash course in the description to help you get started. The next option is a high-level language. Probably C, probably using GBDK. There aren't that many situations where you can consider C a high-level language, but Game Boy programming is one. There are some other language options, but C is the most popular and it has the most mature tooling. One big benefit of using C, or other high-level languages, is the increased productivity. You'll be able to write code faster, and it'll be easier to read when you need to go back to figure out what you were thinking when you wrote that particular function last week. It makes it easier to structure your code, and it's harder to make certain mistakes. Again, that's weird to say about C, but here we are. If you're using C, you're probably going to be using GBDK, a compiler toolchain and libraries for the Game Boy and other systems. Besides just turning your C code into a Game Boy ROM, the libraries provide a lot of helpful high-level functions to make development nicer. Another benefit of C and GBDK is that you can always include some assembly code if you need to. Of course, you don't know what registers are being used by the C code, so you have to be careful. That brings us to one of the downsides. You don't always know what's happening with the hardware under the hood of your C code. As a simple example, the GBDK docs say to avoid reading from VRAM, because if you try to when VRAM isn't accessible, then the code is just going to wait until it is. Maybe that's something you intended to happen, but probably it's just introducing a slowdown that you don't want. This is more to do with GBDK's libraries, so you could run into the same issue in assembly if you're using helper libraries there. But hopefully you see my point. High-level programming environments do helpful things in the background, and sometimes that help can be unexpected. The other downside of C is performance. The compiler doesn't always produce code that's as fast as good handwritten assembly. Generally, the productivity boost is worth whatever performance hit you might take, but sometimes it isn't. Of course, like I said before, you could always include some assembly in your C project, but there's some overhead when doing that. Now for the absolute fastest way to make a game for the Game Boy: GB Studio. GB Studio is a tool I can't gush enough about. It's wonderful. I'm very happy it exists. It's a graphical drag-and-drop game creator for Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. It has pretty much everything you need to make a Game Boy game, and it lets you export your game as either Game Boy ROM, a web-based game so that it can be played online, or as an analog pocket game. It has a lot of functionality to help you out when making a game, like dialogue and menu support, game saving, top-down games, and side-scrolling games, to name a few. It's also pretty popular, with over 1,200 games made with GB Studio listed on itch.io. So why doesn't everyone making Game Boy games just use GB Studio? Well, because it has some downsides. Maybe the biggest showstopper for some projects is performance. If your game really needs every last drop of speed and memory out of the Game Boy, then there's a good chance that GB Studio isn't the right choice. Another downside is that it does come with some constraints. It has limits to the size of background graphics and the number of unique tiles used. It also doesn't have features to support every type of game right out of the box. These constraints can be worked around to some extent though. You can create plugins to add new functionality and new game types. There's a scripting language so that you can implement more complex behaviors. And if you really need to, you can dig into the engine code to really customize things. If you're thinking about starting Game Boy game development, I highly recommend you start playing around with GB Studio, even if you're not planning on developing your game with it. It'll give you a quick way to play around with the Game Boy and maybe prototype some ideas. And if you're completely new to game development, it's going to come up again in the last step of this video. I also want to plug GB Studio Central. It's a community and publication all about GB Studio. It has tips and guides and all sorts of stuff. They even have a print magazine. How cool is that? Okay, that's your toolchain settled. But you'll also need an emulator to test your game, and maybe a flash card. GB Studio comes with an emulator, so you're all set there. But if you're going the C or assembly route, you'll need to get your own. You'll want one with really good debugging support. BGB is one of the standard ones, and the one I'm most familiar with. You might also want a flash card so that you can test your game on an actual Game Boy. An emulator is a lot faster for regular testing and iterating though, plus an emulator's debug features come in pretty handy. Now it's just a matter of playing around with the tools and getting familiar with them, and the Game Boy. Which segues nicely into step 2. Start small. Don't dive right into the massive procedurally generated open world brawler RPG with roguelike shoot 'em up elements and city building minigame that you've had kicking around in your head since you were 12. Make something small so that you get used to developing for the Game Boy. If you've never made a game before, you'll also want to get into the habit of actually getting some ideas onto the screen, rather than getting stuck in planning and ideation. You're also going to need to fail a bunch to learn. So it's better to fail at small things, rather than sinking months into your dream project before you realize you made a fundamental mistake on week 2. And now you probably need to scrap everything and start again. I mean, that's fine too. It's just harder to stay motivated with that strategy. If you're using GB Studio, you can start by making simple single scene things using the assets that are included. If you're using assembly or C, then you can start with getting something moving around on the screen. Then move on to simple games like tic-tac-toe or maybe a simple one-screen maze. Whatever you choose, what's important is that you start to learn about your tools and the system, and start getting the ideas flowing in your head. Learn what's possible on the Game Boy, and what's easy or hard. Once you have some stuff running on a Game Boy, you'll probably want to move on to the next step, figuring out graphics. The Game Boy's graphics system is very different compared to modern technologies. If you're used to or imagining just putting pixels on a screen, then you're going to have to get used to something pretty different. The Game Boy is pretty speed and memory constrained. It doesn't have the power, storage, or memory bandwidth for your game to directly change all 23,040 pixels on the screen. That's not how the Game Boy was meant to be programmed anyway. The Game Boy's graphics are tile-based, so instead of directly modifying the screen's pixels, you modify tiles and where they're meant to be placed on screen. It lets you make big graphical changes with very little work by your game code. So start learning how Game Boy graphics work and how to take advantage of the Game Boy's specific strengths. I have an ongoing, though slowly updating series of videos talking about the Game Boy's graphics that I'll link to in the description. And if you're playing around with graphics, you're probably going to want to start playing around with audio at some point. Again, if you're imagining how modern game development environments work, you're going to have a bunch of interesting learning to do. You have to construct your audio from some basic primitives by controlling their different parameters and timing. In my opinion, it takes a lot of creativity to get the most out of it. If I ever get around to making videos about the Game Boy's audio system, I'll be sure to link them in the description. And now that you've started learning the ins and outs of your tools and the Game Boy, it's time for the last step. Finish something. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's crappy, or too simple, or not fun, or whatever other insult you can throw at it. Just finish it. Get it past that finish line, even if it comes in last and so far behind everyone else that they've all gone home by the time you get there. Just finish it. Then, when it's finished, start another project and get that finished. If you really don't like what you're working on, then sure, abandon it. Don't waste your time, but start another thing and finish that. And you damn well better have learned something from the abandoned project. Like I said, don't waste your time. Try not to give yourself too much of an escape hatch though. It's important that you finish something. You need to learn what it's like to finish. What it takes for you to say, this project is done. To be able to say that, even if the project isn't perfect, even if the project sucks. You're not trying to make good games yet. You're trying to make games, period, so that you can learn how to make good games. And I said in step 1 that if you're completely new to game development, then GB Studio would come up again at the end. Well, this is where GB Studio can really give you a boost. It comes with some pre-made game templates that you can build and play right out of the box. Opening up a program and pressing a button might not seem like finishing something, but you do end up with a working ROM at the end. It's a place to start, and that's important. Now you can go in and start modifying the template. Change some graphics, add a scene, change some dialogue. Whatever tools you use, this is definitely a place where the start small advice can be very helpful. It's going to be a lot faster to finish small projects. Then you can get through more of them, gaining experience. Hopefully you'll come up with some ideas that you don't know how to implement, and you can start digging in and figuring it out. It's also important to plan what finished means for each project. Is it going to just be a prototype or proof of concept? Or do you want it to be a complete game experience? How polished do you want it? Do you want it to be something you're willing to post on itch.io? That gives me a good transition into the bonus step. Get other people to try what you've made. This might be hard for you, especially since I'm telling you to make crappy stuff, but it can be really helpful. Now, I'm not saying you should upload it to itch.io and publicize it all over the internet. Ideally, you have some trusted people you can take advantage of. There's also a Discord server managed by gbdev.io, with channels for people developing things for the Game Boy, and a place to showcase your... My light went out. And a place to showcase your works in progress. That could be a good place to find community. Whatever path you choose, I hope it fires up your creativity and gives you plenty of fun challenges for you to learn from. Remember, the world needs your art. Your voice deserves to be heard. And if the Game Boy is the medium you choose to express yourself with, I hope this video has helped you. If you got into the end and you enjoy this sort of video and this sort of stuff I make, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you really like it, I have a Ko-fi and newly a Patreon. So if you want to help support the channel financially, I'm happy if you go visit there. Well, that's all I've got for today. Bye.